Hi, friends. Welcome to Galatians chapter 3. We are on day 3 today. I'm just going to go ahead and read this. I think this passage is maybe just a little bit tricky for those of us who live in the 21st century and did not grow up Jewish or live in the first century where some of this would have been common knowledge. So let's read and we'll talk about it just a little bit. Galatians chapter 3, starting at verse 15. To give a human example, brothers, even with a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say into his offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. All right, we see this word promise quite a few times. Promise and covenant, I think, go hand in hand. A promise is a verbal commitment by one person to another, agreeing to do something in the future. A covenant, similar, but it's a contractual arrangement, all right? It's more than a verbal promise. It's a contractual arrangement between God and a person or between human beings, which required binding action from one or both parties. And we see this, and we can go back and look at it in Genesis, where God makes this covenant promise with Abraham. Yes, it was a verbal agreement, but he also makes this covenant promise, which was done by, I know it sounds odd to our 21st century ears, but it was done by the sacrifice of animals and the pouring out of their blood and walking through the blood. And there was this, they were saying, look, if I do not fulfill my promise, may it be done to me as it has been done to them. May my blood be spilled. All right. God made that promise on behalf of Abraham. Abraham was just sound asleep. So God made that covenant promise. This is all about God agreeing to do something in the future. And we might ask, okay, what was that promise? What promise did Abraham receive? Well, there were many cross-references in today's passage. One was Genesis 12:7, to your offspring I will give this land. That promise had to do with land. But we talked about yesterday that God promised to make Abraham into this great nation where all the nations of the world would be blessed through him. Acts 13:32 says, this was the apostle saying, and we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, and they go on to talk about Jesus Christ. Romans 4:13, for the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world. Yes, that promise in essence to be this blessing, to make him into a great nation that would bless all the nations of the world, in essence, makes him the heir of the world. And who is his offspring? Well, Paul makes abundantly clear in today's passage that offspring is Jesus Christ. And some of those cross-references I just read speak to that, speak clearly that Jesus is Abraham's offspring. All right. What was I think I've answered, or I've talked about those questions. I did ask, who is Abraham's offspring? You know, we might think it's Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob and then all of the Jews. But in this passage, Paul says, look, Abraham's offspring, the one whom the promise is fulfilled and comes through, that's Jesus Christ. All right. Another question that I ask is, when did Abraham receive the promise? When did he receive the promise? Well, he received it long before the law was given to Moses. The Israelites were in Egypt 430 years, and Paul references that here in verse 17. The cross reference is Exodus 12, verses 40 and 41. So, friend, yesterday we talked about who Abraham was the man chosen by God. He was called to leave the country he was living and go to the land, this promised land that God would show him, and he would make him into this great nation. And his offspring would become this blessing to all the nations of the world. So what is Paul saying here? Well, he points to this idea that, look at a human covenant. Look at a human example of a man-made covenant, and he uses the example of a will. We can look at one of the cross references for the first verse 15 is Hebrews 9:17. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. So here's a will. No one annuls it, meaning no one invalidates it or takes away the legal force or renders it ineffective. Okay, that's what it means to ratify something. It's formally approved, it's invested with legal authority. And all right, even with a human man-made covenant, it can't be annulled once it is legally ratified. It can't be changed in any way. So Paul is basically saying, look, God's promise to Abraham, it can't be annulled. It was not annulled by the law. It is fulfilled by Abraham's offspring, who is Jesus Christ. All right? It is not fulfilled through the law, which is basically exactly what he was saying yesterday. Now, it's interesting. Paul said back in chapter 2:21, if righteousness were through the law, Christ died for no purpose. And we all agreed, oh yeah, that makes sense, Paul. Basically, he says something similar at the end of this passage, verse 18. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise. All right, he's basically saying the exact same thing. But then he affirms, God gave the promise. He gave the blessing to Abraham by a promise. He gave this blessing to Abraham by a promise. Who is the promise? That is Jesus Christ. All right, I hope that helps to tease this out just a little bit. Again, the main point is God's promise to Abraham is fulfilled by his offspring, Jesus Christ. It is not, nor will it ever be, fulfilled by the law. Friends, how do we, well, you know what? Before we apply it, let's ask that golden question like we did yesterday. What is it I learn about God through this passage? Well, God gave a promise to Abraham, right? And we see that God is faithful to his promise. When God speaks, we can rely on, we can trust that it will be so. And that's what we learn about God today. He is true and he is faithful to his promises. And then two, he had a plan from the beginning. Look, he didn't just dream this plan up. No, this was from the beginning. We see it in Genesis chapter 12. All right. Friends, I don't know about you. This just brings me such comfort that when God speaks, it is so that I can trust, I can rely, I can have confidence in God's word, in his promise to us. That gives me comfort. That gives me peace to go into my day. So friends, application, kind of similar to yesterday, rely, trust, have confidence in God's word, in God, in his promise, in Jesus Christ. God is doing his good work and he is faithful to his promises. Oh, let us trust.